This lecture is about religion and reform, a sort of middle period in 19th century America. Among many Americans who devoted their lives to the crusade against slavery, few were as selfless or courageous as Abby Kelly, whose portrait you see on the left. Born in Massachusetts in 1811, she was educated at a Quaker boarding school in Rhode Island, and while teaching in Lynn, Massachusetts, she joined the Female Anti-Slavery Society and in 1838 began speaking on the topic. Her first lecture was literally a baptism by fire, when reports that abolitionists favored amalgamation of, or sexual relations between, the races, and that led Philadelphia residents to burn the meeting hall to the ground. For 2 decades, Kelly spoke throughout the North, in churches, public halls, and anti-slavery homes, and was also active in other pacifist organizations and women's rights, demonstrating the interconnected nature of reform movements. While not the first woman to speak in public, she did so more than any other, challenging her era's idea that a woman's place was in the home. Likewise, she led an unconventional private life as well, being long married to abolitionist Stephen S. Foster, but continuing to lecture soon after the birth of their daughter in 1847. Criticized for not devoting herself to in-home care for her infant, Kelly replied that, quote, "I have done it for the sake of the mothers whose babies are sold away from them. The most precious legacy I can leave my child is a free country." On the right, you see a painting of a Shaker meeting. It's a religious revival meeting, and the center circle was sort of a slow dance movement to express religious fervor. And now on to the rest of the lecture, which is narrated by Dana Flowers.
A woman's rights quilt, made by an unknown woman only a few years after the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, this quilt embodies an unusual form of political expression. It includes scenes visualizing a woman engaged in various activities that violated the era's cult of domesticity, and it illustrates some of the demands of the early women's rights movement. The individual blocks show a woman driving her own buggy and a banner advocating woman rights, another dressing to go out while her husband remains at home wearing an apron, and a third addressing a public meeting with a mixed male-female audience. The subtopics for this lecture are the reform impulse, the crusade against slavery, black and white abolitionism, and the origins of feminism. Abolitionism was only one of the era's reform movements. Alexis de Tocqueville noted that in the absence of a strong national government, voluntary associations provided political and social organization through churches, fraternal orders, political clubs, etc. The reform impulse was rooted in the proliferation of these voluntary groups as Americans organized against liquor and public entertainment and mail delivery on Sunday, as well as in favor of prison, education, and labor reform, all while seeking to emphasize cooperation over competitive individualism. Nearly all of these groups tried to sway public opinion for their causes, sending out speakers, petitions, and publishing pamphlets, with many active in more than one movement. Some, such as liquor reform, were national movements, while others, such as women's rights, unionism, and education reform, were weak or non-existent in the South due to their association with anti-slavery. Many of the reform causes were international, with advocates regularly crisscrossing the Atlantic to promote their ideas. Reformers adopted a wide variety of tactics to achieve social change, including moral suasion and advocacy of governmentally forced reform, while others withdrew from society to establish their own cooperative settlements, hoping to demonstrate the superiority of the collective way of life. While reformers never constituted a majority, they profoundly impacted politics and society. About 100 reform communities were established before the Civil War. These utopian communities varied in structure and motivation. Some were governed by a charismatic leader, others were democratic. Most were religiously motivated, but some had secular origins in desires to reverse social and economic changes unleashed by the market revolution. Nearly all of these communities sought to make society cooperative, restoring social harmony in an increasingly individualistic society, and closing the widening gap between rich and poor. Their efforts to own productive property communally rather than as private individuals introduced socialism and communism into America's political language. Most utopian communities also attempted, in some way, to transform traditional gender roles and marriage patterns, insisting that the abolition of private property must be matched by the abolition of man's property in women. The Shakers were the most successful of the religious utopians, and at their height in the 1840s, they had settlements from Maine to Kentucky, totaling 5,000 members. Founded in the late 18th century by Mother Ann Lee, a British emigrant claiming to be directed by God, the Shakers believed that men and women were spiritual equals and that their work was equally important. They eschewed traditional families. Men and women abstained from sex and lived separately in communal dorms. They were called Shakers for their religious services, which include frenzied dancing. Though they rejected private property, the Shakers found economic success by marketing plant seeds, breeding cattle, and making furniture. Oneida, founded in 1848 in upstate New York by John Humphrey Noyes, was also influential. Noyes, having become an evangelical, preached that he and his followers had achieved moral perfection and were free of sin. Noyes first found a community in Putney, Vermont, where private property was abolished and complex marriage practiced. In Noyes's system of complex marriage, any man could propose sexual relations with any woman, who was free to accept or reject the invitation. Tried for adultery, Noyes left Vermont and founded Oneida, a dictatorial community ruled by Noyes in which an early form of eugenics was practiced, which lasted until 1881. This is an engraving of a Shaker dance drawn by Benson Lossing, an artist who visited a Shaker community and reported on life there for Harper's Magazine in 1857. In the first half of the 19th century, dozens of utopian communities were established in the United States, where small groups of men and women attempted to establish a more perfect social order within the larger society. Religious utopian communities, with their spiritual devotion, strong leaders, and undemocratic governance, tended to last longer than secular utopian communities, which often failed due to internal strife. One notable secular community was Brook Farm, which was founded by New England Transcendentalists in 1841 near Boston. They hoped to show that manual and intellectual labor could coexist, and modeled their community on the ideas of Charles Fourier, a French social reformer who planned communities with communal living and working, but private property for individuals. His settlements, called phalanxes, were planned to the last detail. Brook Farm became a salon of sorts, attracting ministers, writers, and teachers, until residents' dislike for farm labor caused it to disband after a few years. The most important secular communitarian was Robert Owen, a British industrialist, who was appalled by early industrial conditions and built a model textile factory town at New Lanark in Scotland. In 1824, he purchased Harmony, a utopian religious community in Ohio founded earlier in the 19th century by a German Protestant, George Rapp. Here Owen established New Harmony. Owen envisioned a society in which all children would receive education, women would have equal rights, including access to education and divorce rights, and property would be held in common. But divisions at New Harmony led to its dissolution after a few years. Owenism influenced the early labor movement, educational reforms, and women's rights advocates. The Crisis, a publication by the communitarian Robert Owen and his son, Robert Dale Owen. The cover depicts Owen's vision of a planned socialist community. Most Americans saw private property as the basis of economic independence and freedom, and marriage as the basis of the social order. So they were unlikely to join these utopian communities. More typical of the reform impulse were movements directed to freeing men and women from external restraints, such as slavery, or from personal behavior, such as drinking or criminality. Many of these movements were inspired by the religious revivalism of the Second Great Awakening, which encouraged people to believe that sinners were free moral agents who could reform and perfect both themselves and the world. Revivals popularized perfectionism, and regions like upstate New York and northern Ohio became known as the Burned Over District because of the intensive revivalism practiced there in the 1820s and 1830s. These locales became fertile soil for reform movements, and under revivalist influence, older efforts became more radical. Temperance shifted toward the complete elimination of drinking. Criticism of war became outright pacifism, and calls for gradual emancipation transformed into demands for immediate abolition. One such movement was temperance, which had its origins in the North's emerging middle-class culture and its search for respectability through individual self-control. The American Temperance Society, founded in 1826, tried to convince Americans to stop drinking altogether. In the 1830s, the society claimed to have helped hundreds of thousands to stop drinking liquor. But temperance invited great hostility from many Americans who resented others' efforts to change their behavior, which they thought no less moral than that of the temperate. The Drunkard's Progress, an 1826 anti-liquor broadside illustrating how drinking leads a respectable man and his family to ruin. This is a temperance banner from around 1850 and depicts a young man torn between a woman in white, who illustrates female purity, and a temptress, who offers him a drink of liquor. Many Americans saw reform as an assault on their own freedoms. Drinking was prominent at everyday celebrations and events. Taverns were popular meeting places for working men and sites of political discussion, organizational meetings, and popular recreation. American Catholics, Irish and German immigrants in particular, often opposed reform efforts. Unlike Protestant reformers, they viewed sin as inevitable in society and individuals, and they viewed the belief that the world could be perfected as irreligious and productive of reformers' attempts to impose their own worldview on others. Catholics tended to place less emphasis on the individual as a free moral agent, and emphasized communities centered on family and church. Reformers faced a contradiction between their hopes to establish a moral order and to expand personal freedom. Their notion of freedom was both liberating and controlling. They said their goal was to help Americans enjoy genuine liberty by liberating them from the slavery of drink, poverty, and sin. Yet they believed that self-fulfillment derived from self-discipline and that the free individual fully practiced self-control. Reformers worried that Western settlers and immigrants lacked self-control and required either private reform groups or the government to change their behaviors. These associations were especially successful at harnessing new printing technology to influence the era's reform movements. A German beer garden on Sunday evening, an engraving from Harper's Weekly, October 15, 1858. German and Irish immigrants resented efforts of temperance reformers to prohibit the sale of alcoholic beverages. Reform efforts created a multitude of new institutions designed to transform individuals into free, morally upright citizens, performing services once rendered in the family or small community. In the 1830s and 1840s, Americans built jails for criminals, asylums for the mentally ill, and orphanages. These institutions emerged from reformers' belief that social ills could be cured and eliminated by placing individuals in an environment where their character could be changed. While today many of these institutions have become overcrowded and focused mostly on holding inmates at bay away from society, reformers originally hoped to remake the afflicted into productive, self-disciplined citizens. The most significant institution-building effort before the Civil War was the move to establish common schools, tax-supported state school systems open to all children. In the early 19th century, most children were educated, if at all, in local schools, private academies, or at home. Many children had no access to education. Horace Mann, a Massachusetts lawyer and a Whig politician, led efforts to create new common schools. Mann embraced industrialization but hoped that universal public education would restore social equality by bringing children from all social classes together and giving them an equal opportunity for upward social mobility. Mann also insisted that schools would stabilize society by disciplining children and building individual character, teaching obedience to authority and adherence to strict time periods. With support from labor unions, factory owners, and middle-class reformers, by 1860, every northern state had tax-supported school systems for children. In the South, planters viewed literacy among blacks as dangerous and opposed taxation to support the education of poor white children, resulting in slowly developed schools and persistently lagging behind the North in education. The New York House of Refuge, one of many institutions established in the 1820s and 1830s to address social ills by assisting and reforming criminals and the poor. Young boys and girls convicted of petty theft were assigned to the House of Refuge, where they performed supervised labor and received some educational instruction. This daguerreotype from around 1850 captures the students at the Emerson School, the most prominent educational institution for girls in Boston. A male teacher stands at the far right. Compared to drinking, breaking the Sabbath, and illiteracy, the greatest evil in American society first attracted the least attention from reformers. For decades, the only criticism of slavery seemed to come from Quakers, slaves, and free blacks. Before the 1830s, most white Americans who called for the abolition of slavery also supported the colonization of free slaves or their deportation to Africa, the Caribbean, or Central America. In 1816, supporters of this idea founded the American Colonization Society, which promoted the gradual abolition of slavery and the settlement of Black Americans in Africa. It soon established Liberia on the coast of West Africa, to which some free blacks did emigrate. Even though many saw colonization as impractical, prominent political leaders in the Jacksonian era, such as Henry Clay, John Marshall, Daniel Webster, and even Jackson himself, supported the Colonization Society. Many in the North saw colonization as the only means of ending slavery, while Southern colonizationists urged free blacks, whom they regarded as a degraded group that endangered white society, to leave the country. Others simply thought racism was so entrenched that it was safer for blacks, once freed, to leave the nation. Like Indian removal, colonization rested on the premise that America was fundamentally a white society. Of course, while several thousand free blacks did migrate to Liberia, most African Americans opposed the idea of colonization and argued that, as Americans, they had the right to remain in the United States as free and equal citizens. In 1817, some 3,000 free blacks assembled in Philadelphia for the first Black National Convention, in which they resolved to claim their rights while remaining in their homes. Some black organizations even removed the word African from their names to eliminate any possible reason for deportation. This is a pamphlet issued in 1848 by the American Colonization Society, urging free blacks to emigrate to Liberia in West Africa, and defending the society against certain cavillings, that is, abolitionist criticism. The abolitionist movement of the 1830s arose in opposition to colonization and its supporters. The new abolitionists drew on the religious idea that slavery was a sin, and the secular one that it contradicted the values enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. They rejected gradual emancipation and demanded the immediate abolition of slavery. They vociferously criticized slavery and slaveholders and affirmed that blacks, once freed, should become equal citizens of the Republic, not colonizers of distant lands. White abolitionists demanded that race should not prevent the equal enjoyment of economic, civil, and political rights in the United States. They opposed racism in all its forms. The first sign of this new abolitionism was an appeal to the colored citizens of the world, an 1829 pamphlet written by David Walker, a free black in Boston. Walker called on Black Americans to mobilize for abolition, with arms if necessary, and warned Americans that God would punish them if they did not end slavery. Walker invoked the Bible and the Declaration of Independence, but he also asked blacks to take pride in African civilization's achievements and claim their rights as Americans. Walker died under mysterious circumstances. Only with the appearance in 1831 of The Liberator, the weekly journal of William Lloyd Garrison, did the new abolitionism take root. Garrison, a Bostonian, was strident in his rhetoric and unbending in his commitment to abolition. Garrison even suggested that the North should abrogate the Constitution and dissolve the Union in order to end its complicity with slavery. While few abolitionists supported this notion, many adopted his criticisms of colonization and called for immediate abolition. While other anti-slavery publications emerged en masse, The Liberator continued as the preeminent abolitionist journal. This is an abolitionist banner. Anti-slavery organizations adopted the Liberty Bell as a symbol of their campaign to extend freedom to Black Americans. Previously, the bell, forged in Philadelphia in the 18th century, had simply been known as the Old State House Bell. This is the frontispiece of the 1848 edition of David Walker's Appeal and Henry Highland Garnet's Address to the Slaves, and depicts a Black figure receiving liberty and justice from heaven. This is William Lloyd Garrison, editor of The Liberator and one of the country's most prominent abolitionists, in an undated portrait by Edwin T. Billings. The abolitionist movement quickly spread from a handful of activists to thousands of villages, towns, and cities throughout the North. They took advantage of new print technology and expanding literacy by printing and distributing enormous amounts of pamphlets, newspapers, books, novels, and broadsides. Between the formation of the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1833 and 1840, about 100,000 Northerners joined local abolition groups. Most were ordinary citizens, although a few prominent men, such as the New York merchants Arthur and Lewis Tappan, also joined. Theodore Weld, an evangelical minister, helped create a mass constituency for abolition by using the methods of the revivalists, calling slavery a sin that could only be absolved by immediate abolition. Furthermore, abolitionists pioneered modern fundraising methods such as charity fairs, where products provided by anti-slavery advocates were sold, and the proceeds donated to the cause. The efforts were a foretaste of later consumer activism. While many Southerners believed that the abolitionists hoped to incite a slave insurrection, nearly all abolitionists, despite their militant rhetoric, rejected violence as a means of ending slavery. Many were pacifists or non-resistants who believed that coercion had to be eliminated from all human institutions and relationships. They adopted the strategy of moral suasion, or convincing slaveholders to end their sinful ways and shaming Northerners into action. Abolitionists were the first in American history to try to transform society by changing mass opinion through education and agitation, instead of infiltrating existing political parties. Abolitionism both reinforced and challenged Jacksonian America's common understandings of freedom. It helped to popularize the market revolution concept that freedom was rooted not in property ownership, but self-ownership, and the right to enjoy the fruits of one's own labor. Abolitionists repudiated wage slavery, popularized by the labor movement and Southern defenders of slavery alike. Instead, they insisted the wage laborer was the embodiment of freedom, with the opportunity to change jobs at will, accumulate property, and enjoy a stable family life, freedoms denied to slaves. On the other hand, abolitionists felt that slavery was so deeply embedded in the United States that fundamental changes nationwide would have to occur. Personal liberty took precedence over other forms of freedom, such as property rights and local self-government. These are pages from an abolitionist book for children. Abolitionists sought to convince young and old of the evils of slavery. This is Slave Market of America, an engraving produced by the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1836, and illustrates how abolitionists sought to identify their cause with American traditions, even as they mocked the nation's claim to be a land of the free. Here is a rare photograph of an abolitionist meeting in New York State around 1850. Frederick Douglass is at the left of the woman at the center. The crusade against slavery gave birth to a new understanding of citizenship and the rights it entailed. A new answer to the question, who is an American? Long before the Civil War, abolitionists, black and white, developed a definition of national citizenship severed from the concept of race. with citizens' rights enforced by the federal government. Abolitionists campaigned for Northern free blacks' right to vote, access to education, and equal treatment by transportation companies and public accommodations such as hotels and theaters. They put forward ideas that would be incorporated into the laws and Constitution after the Civil War. That any person born in the United States was entitled to American citizenship, and that citizens should enjoy full equality regardless of race. The anti-slavery conventions organized by free blacks promoted the principle of birthright citizenship, commonly describing themselves as gatherings of colored citizens. They seized upon the Constitution's language requiring the president to be a natural-born citizen to argue that American citizenship derived from place of birth, not ancestry or race. Black leaders insistently claimed the same civil and political rights as enjoyed by white citizens, as well as public rights. Free blacks and their white allies used a variety of tactics to press for citizenship rights. Their efforts were usually unsuccessful, but they did win a few victories. These campaigns helped to establish a new discourse of citizens' rights. The abolitionists tried to reassert that freedom was a universal entitlement in an age when freedom and citizenship had become associated with whiteness. The idea that Americans could be a single people, undifferentiated by race, has its origins with the abolitionists, not the Founding Fathers. Anti-slavery activists viewed slaves and free blacks as equal members of the national community, a concept summarized by Lydia Maria Child in her 1833 work, An Appeal in Favor of That Class of Americans Called Africans. They argued that birthplace, not race, should determine who was an American, an idea later enshrined in the 14th Amendment. They were the first to argue that human rights were more important than national sovereignty, and they urged enforcement of international laws against the slave trade and slavery. While some abolitionists, such as Garrison, detested the Constitution as a covenant with the devil, others, like Frederick Douglass, believed that it offered no protections to slavery. But abolitionists invented the concept of equality before the law, regardless of race. And they consciously presented abolition as the culmination of the Revolution's values of liberty and equality. Abolitionists seized upon the language of the Declaration of Independence and created from the old State House bell the symbol of the Liberty Bell. Of course, all Americans claimed their political beliefs were representations of the revolutionary legacy, including Southern slave owners. Abolitionists never represented more than a small portion of the Northern population, but as the controversy intensified, their belief that slavery contradicted the national heritage of freedom spread far beyond their own circles. This is Anti-Slavery Picnic at Weymouth Landing, Massachusetts, a watercolor from 1845, and depicts dozens of men, women, and children at an abolitionist gathering. Unlike most social events of the time, it includes both black and white participants. The artist, Susan Torrey Merritt, painted the tiny figures separately and then cut them out and pasted them on the paper. The red flag at the upper left proclaims liberty, possibly an allusion to the anti-slavery Liberty Party. This is one of many popular lithographs illustrating scenes from Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, the most widely read of all anti-slavery writings. This depicts the slave Eliza escaping with her child across the ice floes of the Ohio River. Blacks played a leading role in the abolitionist movement. Northern blacks, attracted to Garrison's opposition to colonization and his demand for equal rights, were half of the Liberator's subscribers. Several blacks were leaders of the American Anti-Slavery Society, and Northern-born blacks and fugitive slaves, such as Frederick Douglass, quickly became major organizers and speakers. Many fugitive slaves published accounts of their experience of slavery, which became powerful tools in communicating the reality of slavery to Northern audiences. Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel published by Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1852, was based on one fugitive slave's life and sold more than 1 million copies in only a few years. Even though abolitionism was the first racially integrated social movement in American history and the first to make equal rights for blacks central to its agenda, the movement could not avoid the racism prevalent in white America. white abolitionists did not entirely free themselves of racial prejudice. They monopolized key decision-making positions and resources in the movement. By the 1840s, Black abolitionists, frustrated with white control, started to hold their own Black abolitionist conventions. Some, like Henry Highland Garnet, departed from the white movement by calling for violent resistance to slavery. Nevertheless, white and Black abolitionists did mount legal and political campaigns against racial discrimination in northern states. They had a few victories, including ending school segregation in Massachusetts. Black abolitionists in particular challenged whites to recognize Blacks as equal citizens and fellow human beings, and they undermined intellectual and cultural arguments for white supremacy. Black abolitionists took every opportunity to reject the nation's pretensions as a land of liberty, and many reversed the common association between the United States and freedom's progress. Black communities in the North devised an alternative calendar of freedom celebrations centered on the anniversary of the slave trade ban and West Indian freedom in place of July 4th. Instead, Black abolitionists declared Britain the model of liberty and justice after its 1830s embrace of emancipation, contrasting it with United States tyranny. They also connected free Black poverty to slavery and insisted freedom possessed an economic dimension. In 1852, Frederick Douglass delivered the greatest oration on American slavery and freedom in Rochester, New York. He focused on the hypocrisy of a nation celebrating freedom on Independence Day while allowing slavery to flourish. Rather than deny the founder's legacy, he drew upon it, arguing that subsequent generations had strayed from a rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence. He insisted that the United States could only continue its original mission through abolition, which would free the great doctrines of the Declaration of Independence from the narrow bounds of race. This portrait of Harriet Beecher Stowe was painted by Alanson Fisher in 1853, shortly after the publication of Stowe's anti-slavery novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. This is an illustration from Types of Mankind, an 1854 book by the physicians and racial theorists Josiah C. Nott and George R. Glidden, who argued that Blacks formed a separate species, midway between whites and chimpanzees. Abolitionists sought to counter the pseudoscientific defenses of slavery and racism. This is a photograph of Frederick Douglass, the fugitive slave who became a prominent abolitionist, taken between 1847 and 1852. As a fellow abolitionist noted at the time, the very look and bearing of Douglass are an irresistible logic against the oppression of his race. Abolitionism initially sparked violent hostility from Northerners who thought the movement threatened to dissolve the Union, interfere with profits originating in slave labor, and overthrow white supremacy. Led by gentlemen of property and standing, usually merchants with economic ties to the South, mobs disrupted abolitionist meetings, destroyed abolitionist printing presses, and assaulted abolitionist activists. William Lloyd Garrison was nearly lynched by one Boston mob. In 1837, the anti-slavery editor Elijah Lovejoy was killed by a mob in Illinois while defending the printing press for his newspaper from assault for the fifth and final time. Andrew Jackson's attorney general allowed abolitionist literature to be removed from the mails. In 1836, when abolitionists flooded the House of Representatives with petitions calling for emancipation in Washington, D.C., the House adopted the gag rule, which prohibited that body from considering the petitions. The rule was repealed in 1844, in great part due to the efforts of former President John Quincy Adams. By then, attacks on the free speech of abolitionists convinced many Northerners that slavery was incompatible with the democratic liberties of white Americans. Abolitionists broadened their appeal in order to win the support of Northerners who cared little for Black rights, but could be persuaded that slavery threatened their own freedoms. The struggle to discuss slavery and its abolition in public made abolitionism the first great struggle for free speech in American history. Am I not a man and a brother? This is the most common abolitionist depiction of a slave. This image both presents African Americans as unthreatening individuals seeking white assistance and calls upon white Americans to recognize Blacks as fellow men unjustly held in bondage. This is a broadside calling on fellow citizens to disrupt an 1837 lecture by an abolitionist of the most revolting character. Immediate Emancipation Illustrated, an anti-abolitionist cartoon from 1833, members of an anti-slavery society prepared to write a pamphlet calling for immediate abolition. The statue of the leopard is meant to remind viewers of the biblical phrase, "Can the Ethiopian change his skin or the leopard his spots?" That is, the black's condition is fixed by nature. On the left is a reminder of the Haitian Revolution, with slaves massacring a white family. The emancipated slave has only one interest: food. Destruction by Fire of Pennsylvania Hall, a lithograph depicting the burning of the abolitionist meeting hall by a Philadelphia mob in 1838. Much of the abolitionism's strength was found in Northern women who joined in large numbers. Most were evangelical Protestants, New England Congregationalists, or Quakers, who thought that slavery violated Christian belief and practice. The public sphere was open to women in ways that government and party politics were not. They could not vote, but they could circulate petitions, attend meetings, march in parades, and speak in public. Women were active in the Temperance movement, building asylums and other reform campaigns. Women were also critical in campaigns to redeem prostitutes from sin and protect the morality of single women, and they attacked the sexual double standard by identifying men who frequented prostitutes or abused women. Women's participation in abolitionism inspired the early movement for women's rights. In fighting for the rights of slaves, women gained a new understanding of their own subordination in society and law. Angelina and Sarah Grimke, daughters of a South Carolina slaveholder, converted to Quakerism and abolitionism while visiting Philadelphia and began to denounce slavery in public. They had been preceded by Fanny Wright, a Scottish-born follower of Robert Owen, who spoke on communitarianism, slavery, and labor reform in the late 1820s and early 1830s. The Grimke Sisters used controversy over their speeches to denounce the idea that it was unfeminine for women to engage in public activity. Male criticism led them to advocate the necessity for sexual equality in all spheres of life. The Grimke Sisters were the first to apply the abolitionist doctrine of universal freedom and equality to women's status. Their work and writings helped inspire other women to adopt the standard of women's rights in the early 1840s. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, who became key organizers of the Seneca Falls Convention, the Women's Rights Convention of 1848, were anti-slavery activists. They had been barred from abolitionist meetings because of their sex. The Seneca Falls Convention raised the issue of woman suffrage for the first time in American history. The Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments, modeled on the Declaration of Independence, added women to Jefferson's proposition that all men are created equal, and listed the injuries men had inflicted on women, including denying them the right to vote. The Seneca Falls Convention further denounced an entire social structure that denied women access to education, employment, property and wages, and children in the event of divorce, deprived women of independent legal status when they married, and restricted them to the home. Like abolitionism, temperance, and other reforms, feminism was international, and though it lacked broad backing at home, allies were found abroad. Manufactured goods and domestic servants diminished household chores, and many women chafed at restrictions on their opportunities for gaining an education, to enter a profession and exercise talents. Married or not, feminists insisted women deserved the range of individual choices and self-realization that constituted freedom. Margaret Fuller furthered these ideas as a writer, and in 1844 became the first woman to be appointed literary editor of the New York Tribune. She argued that the transcendentalist idea that freedom meant personal development applied to women. The May session of the Women's Rights Convention, a cartoon published in Harper's Weekly, June 11, 1859. Here, a female orator addresses the audience of men and women, while hecklers in the balcony disrupt the proceedings. The artist Thomas Hicks painted this portrait of the feminist writer and editor Margaret Fuller in 1848, 2 years before she died in a shipwreck as she was returning from a sojourn in Europe. Women also insisted on the right to participate in the market revolution. Although women at Seneca Falls were mostly middle class, attendees rejected the notion that the home was women's sphere. Early feminists challenged this idea in a number of ways. Some wore a new style of dress made of loose-fitting tunics and trousers called bloomers, intended to liberate women from the extremely restrictive dresses and corsets that so confined them as to make it impossible for them to engage in much physical activity. While feminism, by calling for rights equal to men, in one sense demanded an expansion of freedom rather than its redefinition, in another sense, feminism challenged prevailing notions of women's innate difference, that women were naturally dependent and irrational, that the world was divided into public and private spheres, and that issues of justice and fairness did not apply to family relations. Feminists used slavery to coin a concept, the slavery of sex, that critiqued all aspects of women's subordination to male authority. While Mary Wollstonecraft had, much earlier, made an analogy between marriage and slavery, this analogy was spread by abolitionism. Southern defenders of slavery often linked slavery and marriage as natural forms of inequality. Of course, while slavery and marriage were technically different, married women, until the passage of women's property and wage laws around the time of the Civil War, could not own their own property or retain their own wages, which instead accrued to their husbands. Woman's Emancipation, a satirical engraving from Harper's Monthly, August 1851, illustrating the much-ridiculed bloomer costume. Am I not a woman and a sister? This is an illustration from The Liberator in 1849. Identifying with the plight of the female slave enabled free women to see more clearly the inequalities they themselves faced. Inspired by abolitionism, advocates for women's rights turned the popular understanding of self-ownership, or control over one's person, in a new direction. The abolitionists' emphasis on the slave master's violation of the slave woman's body lent a new reality to the ideal of self-ownership for women's rights activists. The law of domestic relations assumed a husband's right of sexual access to his wife and his right to inflict corporal punishment on her. Courts generally did not interfere in cases of physical or sexual abuse unless it was extreme. The issue of women's private freedom showed underlying differences in the women's rights movement, a belief in equality between the sexes and notions of natural differences between men and women coexisted in the movement. Even as some feminists entered the public sphere and challenged aspects of the cult of domesticity, they accepted other dimensions of women's subordination. Even staunch feminists like Susan B. Anthony avoided discussion of women's sexual freedoms, in and out of marriage. Yet the gradual decline in birth rates over the course of the 19th century indicates that many women exercised more freedom in their intimate lives. Even in reform circles, the issue of women's rights was very controversial. Abolitionist men who welcomed women's participation typically did not welcome their advocacy of rights for themselves. Disagreement over women's proper role in abolitionist activity sparked a split in abolitionist ranks in 1840. The appointment of a female abolitionist to the business committee of the American Anti-Slavery Society caused male abolitionists who believed women should not occupy such a prominent position to form their own rival organization, the American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society. Behind the split was a fear among some abolitionists that Garrison's radicalism on issues like women's rights and his refusal to endorse voting or running candidates for office was stunting the movement's growth. To make abolitionism a political movement, these men formed the Liberty Party, whose candidate for president in 1840 received only 1/3 of 1% of the total vote. While the achievement of the goals of the women's rights movement lay far in the future, by 1840, the abolitionist movement had accomplished its most important work. It had spread the message of anti-slavery throughout the North and awakened a broad array of people and groups to the evils of slavery and the necessity of its abolition. The movement's greatest achievement was ending the conspiracy of silence that attempted to maintain national unity by suppressing public debate on slavery. This image appeared on the cover of the sheet music for Get Off the Track, a song popularized by the Hutchinson Singers who performed anti-slavery songs. The train's immediate emancipation, with the Liberator as its front wheel, and Liberty Party pulled into a railroad station. The Herald of Freedom and American Standard were anti-slavery newspapers. The song's lyrics praised William Lloyd Garrison and criticized various politicians, among them Henry Clay. The chorus went, "Roll it along, through the nation, freedom's car, emancipation."